Hello everyone and welcome. I have a really fun background idea for you. I came across something called Squeegee art, where you use acrylic paints and squeegee to create abstract backgrounds. You can create very crazy, complicated backgrounds, but for this video I created a very simple background that you can use for your cards or other projects. So what kind of supplies do you need? You will need a cardstock, something smooth. I'm using here a cardstock from House of Cards. You could use Bristol cardstock. Nina Solo White should work as well. You will also need a squeegee. I tried the one you use for cleaning, but since I'm using a cardstock in the size of my card, I found it a little bit hard to handle. So my husband used his 3D printer and printed one small squeegee for me. It's not perfect as it wasn't smooth, but I added a duct tape over it and it did the job. You could also use an old credit card, a gift card. I saw someone using a piece of cardboard, or also you can use laminated cardstock. Since you will need to clean the squeegee, you will also need something for cleaning. I used a paper towel and baby wipes. And I also will be using a mixing palette, a brush, and a jar of water. This is pretty much optional. I just found it easier to apply the ink this way. This just depends on the paints you have. And of course, you will need some acrylic paints. I have here a few brands. These big tubes I got for Christmas. I don't really know the brand. Then I have paints from Lidl and these smaller tubes from a set that I got a few years ago. You don't need anything expensive, just use whatever you already have or is in your budget. So let's make the background. This video, as well as the background, was inspired by Andrea Nelson. I will leave the link to her channel in the description below. So first, quickly, how you created the lines. You put the paint where you want the line to start. You can place it directly onto the background, but if you want to go from side to side, which I mostly did, you place the paint at the edge over the washi or painter's tape, depending what you're using, and then with the squeegee, you drag the paint to the other side. The shape of the line is completely up to you. So now let's start with my actual background. That was just a practice piece. And because I'm new to this kind of art, let me share what I've learned so you can avoid some of my mistakes. The first thing I learned very quickly is to use a palette and a brush to apply the paint to the paper. Especially with the big bottles, it was difficult to see. And since I was using a smaller cardstock, I wanted to avoid using too much paint, and with a brush, I had more control. Paint bottles with the nozzles might be a great option, or those paints in the smaller tubes, those were easier to control. So I first squeezed the paint onto the palette. If needed, I mixed in a little bit of water, and then with my brush, I scooped up the paint and applied it onto the paper, or in this case, the washi tape. Then, using my squeegee, I scraped the paint, creating a squiggly line. The brush was also great if I needed or thought I needed to adjust the line. Looking at it now, it was not really needed. I did that on all the lines, but here on this pink one, I applied more saturated color to have a more darker shade, and I thought it worked very well and it does look really nice. You could go over the line again with the squeegee, but with the brush it was just easier. Another thing I learned here is you need to figure out the consistency of the paint that works for you. What I didn't like is a thick paint. It was quite difficult to work with. What I would advise is to start with a damp brush and mix it up a bit, and if needed, add a little bit more water, because you don't want to make the paint too watery, which for me at least, that did not work very well either. That's what I did on this blue paint, and when I was happy with the consistency, I used my brush and applied to the side of the paper, and then with my squeegee, I created the line. And I also adjusted the line with my brush, just a bit. And this brings me to the next thing I learned. I cleaned my squeegee between each line with a baby wipe, and then I dried it with a paper towel. The squeegee doesn't need to be fully dry, but going over the paper towel showed me if there is any leftover paint. Cleaning the squeegee was quite obvious. What I also learned, I needed to clean the sides, the leftover paint that was on the washi after I created the line. This is just to avoid contamination of colors, which happened on my trial run. You might not need to have to do this. Your paint might be dry or you use up all the paint, but in my case, I have to do that before painting another line. The next thing I learned is how much paint is needed. This should differ depending on the size of the cardstock you are using. On a bigger cardstock, you could use more paint. You could create a longer line along the side to make a thicker line. But since I was using a smaller cardstock, I was squishing smaller dots, so the line is not too thick. I still needed enough paint to create the line, but I didn't want it to be too wide. So if I needed more paint to create a longer line, I created more like domed blobs of paint. And that's why I used the palette, because it was easier to create these dots. I created one more line using this really pretty green paint, and I also used my brush to adjust it a bit. Looking back at it, this was not really needed. And next, I applied the paint directly onto the cardstock. First, I used a black paint. I picked up the paint with my brush and randomly applied the paint, or more like blobs of paint, across the panel. And then I thought it would be fun if I added a metallic paint to it. The set of tube paints have gold and silver, and I picked silver. This one I didn't need to add to the palette. It was easy to apply directly from the tube. And one more thing before I use the squeegee. This part I took directly from Andrea's video, including the color, because I need something light and I didn't want to be mixing. I used yellow paint and I applied it along the whole top of the cardstock, on top of the washi tape. And then I took the squeegee and spread the paint from top to bottom. And I think it looks pretty cool. But I thought there were still a few empty spaces, so I let it dry. This doesn't take too long. And then I mixed white and orange to create a lighter orange, and I created two U-shaped lines. Looking back at it, I probably would not mix the lighter orange, just use the orange from the tube to make it more bold, but at that time I did not want to mess it up. You really need to play with this, especially to see how much paint you need and what colors and so on. But even with the backgrounds I would say I messed up, I still really like and would use it for a background. So I removed the washi and here is the background I made. I absolutely love it. I'm not sure if I will use it for a card because I thought this would be great in a picture frame, but I made another background like this and that one I used for a card. This was my learning piece and there were a few mistakes, but I still like it. This is a messy art, so it's quite difficult to really mess it up so it's unusable. And my card idea for these backgrounds is to use a big bold greeting, either stamped or die cut. If you would like to try out another project with acrylic paints, check out this video where I used the acrylic paints to stamp with leaves. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.